He had it all: power, money, and absolute control over his life. Ethan Crawford, a confident and charismatic millionaire, had never encountered a limit he couldn't overcome until one night, surrounded by laughter and high stakes, he accepted a challenge that would change everything. Margot Bennett, a strong woman with secrets and a completely different outlook on life, enters his world as part of a bet. But nothing about her is simple. This isn't just a story about control or power. It's a game of emotions, redemption, and love. The story I'm about to tell you is called The Gamble of Hearts. Get ready, because nothing will be as you expect. Ethan Crawford's world was one of precision and control, a meticulously crafted empire of wealth and influence. At 34, he was a man who had it all: money, power, and an unshakable reputation as a winner. Tonight, under the glittering chandeliers of a Manhattan penthouse, he played the role he knew best: the unflappable alpha. The room hummed with the chatter of New York's elite. Expensive suits and sparkling gowns filled the space as glasses of champagne clinked and laughter echoed against the high ceilings. Ethan leaned casually against the grand piano, a faint smirk playing on his lips as Victor Haynes, his longtime friend and occasional rival, approached. Victor, dressed in a tailored navy suit, carried an air of mischief that was hard to ignore. "Ethan," Victor began, swirling the champagne in his glass, "tell me something. Have you ever met a challenge you couldn't win?" Ethan chuckled, his confidence as solid as the marble floor beneath them. "Not yet, but I'll let you know if it ever happens." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly baiting him. "Interesting, because I've got one for you, a real challenge." Ethan's smirk deepened. "Go on." Victor leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough to hint at intrigue. "There's someone I want you to meet. Her name is Margot Bennett. Well, let's just say she's not the type of woman you usually go for." Ethan raised his glass but didn't drink, his interest piqued. "Not my type? Victor, you're gonna have to be more specific. I don't like puzzles." "She's intelligent, independent," and Victor paused for dramatic effect. "Unimpressed by men like you." The remark drew a ripple of amusement from Ethan, but he wasn't deterred. "Unimpressed, you say? That's a rarity. What's the catch?" Victor grinned, clearly pleased to have captured Ethan's attention. "The catch is this. I bet you can't win her over. 6 months to charm her, and I'll donate $1 million to the charity of your choice. Fail and you match my donation." The room seemed to still as Ethan considered the proposition. $1 million was a tempting prize, but the real allure was the challenge itself. Ethan lived for competition, and the idea of someone immune to his charm felt like an insult waiting to be disproven. 6 months. Ethan echoed, his voice light but calculated. "And she has to agree to date me? No tricks, no shortcuts." "Exactly," Victor confirmed, raising his glass. Ethan's smirk returned. "Consider it done." 3 days later, Ethan sat at a polished wooden table in a private lounge, waiting for the woman who had suddenly become the focus of his next victory. He had done his homework. Margot Bennett was a professor of literature, ran a struggling nonprofit for underserved communities, and avoided the social spotlight. When the door opened, Ethan's practiced composure almost slipped. Margot walked in, her confidence as striking as her appearance. She wasn't the kind of woman who tried to blend in. Her curvy frame was elegantly dressed in a deep burgundy dress, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, assessing him the way one might study a painting or a puzzle. "You must be Ethan Crawford," she said, her tone calm but firm. "And you must be Margot Bennett," Ethan replied, extending a hand with his signature charming smile. Margot hesitated briefly before shaking his hand, her grip firm, her expression unreadable. "Let's not waste time. I know why you asked to meet me, and I'm curious to hear your pitch." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by her directness. Most people danced around him, eager to please or impress. Margot, it seemed, was different. My pitch, he began smoothly, recovering his composure, is simple. I admire your work with your nonprofit. I'd like to help fund it. Margot raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. I've been in this field long enough to know that funding usually comes with strings. What do you want in return, Mr. Crawford? Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her. She wasn't just sharp. She was several steps ahead. Let's say I'm interested in getting to know you better. Call it a personal investment. Margot tilted her head, her gaze narrowing. You're not exactly subtle, are you? Ethan smiled, leaning forward. Why waste time with subtlety? You're clearly not a woman who appreciates games. Margot's lips curved into the faintest smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Games, no. Transparency, yes. So, if this investment of yours benefits my nonprofit without compromising my work, I'll consider it. But don't think for a second that I'm not paying attention. Ethan chuckled softly. I wouldn't dare underestimate you. As Margot stood to leave, Ethan watched her go, his confidence shaken but his determination renewed. This wasn't going to be easy, but he thrived on challenges. And deep down, he already knew Margot Bennett was unlike anyone he'd ever met. The cafe was a far cry from the glamorous venues Ethan Crawford usually frequented. It had an air of modesty, with faded wooden chairs and the hum of quiet conversations blending with the faint sound of an old jazz record playing in the background. Ethan checked his watch, a sharp contrast to the cozy atmosphere, its sleek face glinting against the warm light. Margot Bennett had chosen this place for their meeting, and he had reluctantly agreed, curious to see what kind of person intentionally avoided luxury. She was late, only by 5 minutes, but it was enough to annoy Ethan. He wasn't used to waiting. He was about to pull out his phone when the door creaked open, and there she was. Margot walked in with the kind of confidence that didn't need announcing. She wore a long gray coat over a simple navy dress, her hair loosely framing her face. The air around her was different, not showy, not rehearsed. She was real in a way that unsettled Ethan, but he couldn't explain why. As she approached the table, her eyes scanned him briefly, sharp and calculating. Ethan stood out of habit, offering a polite smile. Margot, he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Thanks for meeting me. She slipped off her coat and sat down, placing her bag carefully by her side. Let's not pretend you didn't plan this meeting meticulously, she replied, her tone calm but firm. You don't seem like a man who leaves things to chance. Ethan chuckled softly, adjusting his cufflinks. Guilty. I like to know who I'm dealing with. Margot leaned back, crossing her arms. And what have you figured out so far? He paused, caught off guard by her directness. Most people in his world would dance around such a question, either out of politeness or intimidation. Margot was neither polite nor intimidated. You're passionate about your work, he began, choosing his words carefully. Your nonprofit is one of the few truly impactful organizations in the city. That takes dedication. Her expression softened, but only slightly. Flattery won't get you far, Mr. Crawford. What do you want? Ethan smiled, leaning forward. To help. Your nonprofit deserves better funding, and I can make that happen. Call it a gesture of goodwill. Margot raised an eyebrow. Goodwill? From a man whose empire was built on cutthroat deals? Forgive me if I'm skeptical. Ethan leaned back, feigning a look of mock offense. You wound me. But seriously, Margot, I'm not here to play games. I believe in your cause, and I'd like to be involved. Her gaze didn't waver. And what do you get out of it? He hesitated, just for a second, before responding. The satisfaction of doing something meaningful. Isn't that enough? Margot studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Maybe, but I don't trust easily, Mr. Crawford. If you're serious, I'll consider your help. But let's be clear. My work comes first, and I don't compromise. Ethan nodded, hiding the flicker of amusement that threatened to show. She was a tough negotiator, and he liked that. Fair enough, but at least call me Ethan. No need to be so formal. Margot allowed a small smile, though it felt more like a test than a concession. Fine, Ethan, but don't mistake my civility for trust. I'll be watching. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Ethan found himself stepping further into Margot's world. Boardrooms filled with hopeful yet underfunded nonprofit leaders, late-night fundraisers in dimly lit community centers, and casual coffee breaks that revealed glimpses of her personality. Despite her initial hesitance, Margot began to soften, though only slightly. She remained guarded, always ready to push back if Ethan crossed a line. He, on the other hand, started to see her not just as a challenge, but as someone fascinating. Her sharp wit, her dedication, and even her quiet moments of vulnerability began to intrigue him in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser, they found themselves alone, tidying up the venue. Ethan offered to drive her home, but Margot declined, insisting she could manage. As she gathered her things, she glanced at him and said, "You know, for someone who's used to winning, you're surprisingly persistent in this collaboration." Ethan grinned. "I like to think of it as being thorough." Margot shook her head, smiling despite herself. "Just remember, I'm not like the people in your world. I don't care about your money or your influence." "I'm starting to realize that," he admitted, his tone more sincere than he intended. Margot hesitated for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she simply said, "Good," before walking out the door, leaving Ethan standing there, wondering why her approval suddenly mattered so much. And for the first time, Ethan Crawford began to question whether he was still playing the game, or if the game was starting to play him. Ethan wasn't sure when the game had started to change. Margot Bennett was supposed to be a challenge, a box to check, a puzzle to solve. Yet, each encounter with her left him grappling with something he couldn't name. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. Her confidence didn't demand attention. It commanded it. Her kindness wasn't naive. It was calculated and precise. And her trust. Well, he hadn't earned that yet, but for some reason, he was beginning to want it. They met again at a small bookshop tucked away in the heart of the city. Margot had asked him to join her for a community event she was hosting, and Ethan had reluctantly agreed. The venue was nothing like the high-end spaces he was used to. Narrow aisles packed with books, warm lighting, and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Margot was already there when he arrived, wearing a loose cardigan and jeans, her hair tied back in a simple bun. She looked nothing like the glamorous women he usually surrounded himself with. Yet there was something magnetic about her presence. "You're late," she said, glancing at her watch. "I prefer fashionably delayed," Ethan replied with a smirk, though her unimpressed look quickly wiped it away. "Fine. I got caught in traffic." "Excuses," she muttered, handing him a clipboard. "Here, since you're here, you might as well make yourself useful. Help me collect donations." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Donations? Isn't that your specialty?" Margot shot him a pointed look. "Don't tell me you're scared of asking people to give a little back." He chuckled, shaking his head as he took the clipboard. "Scared? Hardly. But I can't guarantee I'll be as charming as you." The evening was a whirlwind. Ethan watched as Margot moved effortlessly through the crowd, engaging people with sincerity and passion. She wasn't just hosting the event. She was the heart of it. Ethan, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. His usual tactics, charisma, charm, and subtle manipulation, felt out of place here. These people weren't impressed by power or wealth. They were drawn to authenticity, something Margot seemed to embody effortlessly. After the event, Ethan found himself sitting across from Margot at a nearby cafe, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. For the first time in years, he felt out of his depth. "You did well tonight," Margot said, breaking the silence. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "I doubt that. Most people looked at me like I was trying to sell them something." "That's because you were," she replied, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. People can sense when someone's not genuine. They need to know you care. "And what makes you think I don't?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Margot's smile faded as she studied him. "Because you haven't figured out why you're here yet. This isn't just about helping me or my nonprofit, Ethan. There's something you're trying to prove to me, to yourself. But you're not there yet." Her words lingered long after she left. Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit cafe, staring into his coffee. What was he trying to prove? That he could win? That he could conquer Margot's defenses? Or was it something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit? Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Margot's interactions became more frequent. She invited him to join her at various events, each one more grassroots and understated than the last. Ethan, to his own surprise, kept showing up. At one point, during a late-night volunteer event at a shelter, Ethan found himself stacking chairs alongside Margot. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of the city outside. "You know," he began, breaking the silence, "this isn't exactly the kind of thing I imagined doing a few months ago." Margot glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, and what did you imagine?" Ethan smirked, something with more champagne and less heavy lifting. She laughed softly, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. "You're adapting, Crawford. Maybe there's hope for you yet." The comment was lighthearted, but it struck something deep in Ethan. He realized he cared about what Margot thought of him, more than he had expected. And yet, she still kept him at arm's length, her barriers as solid as ever. But one evening, as they parted ways after another event, Margot said something that stayed with him. "You're not as bad as I thought," she admitted, her voice soft. "But don't think for a second that I'm letting my guard down." As she walked away, Ethan felt an odd mixture of frustration and intrigue. Margot was letting him in, slowly, carefully, but she was still holding something back. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if he was the one who needed to prove himself worthy of her trust. It was a crisp autumn evening when Margot's world tilted. The city hummed with its usual energy, but inside the elegant hall where she stood, her mind raced. The fundraiser was in full swing, yet Margot felt like an outsider in her own event. Something had been gnawing at her, a faint unease she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until Victor Haynes entered the room, his smirk too knowing, that the puzzle pieces started to shift. Victor approached her with the confidence of a man who knew he was about to stir the pot. "Margot," he greeted smoothly, holding a glass of wine. "Stunning as always. And thriving, I see. Ethan must be working miracles for your nonprofit." Margot gave him a polite smile, her instincts on high alert. "It's been a productive collaboration. Ethan has been helpful." Victor chuckled, swirling his wine. "Helpful? That's one way to put it. I'd say he's quite motivated, considering the stakes." She froze, the smile on her face stiffening. "The stakes?" Victor took a slow sip, savoring her reaction. "Oh, you didn't know? Well, let's just say Ethan doesn't do anything without a bit of incentive. I mean, a man like him taking an interest in grassroots causes? Quite the departure." Margot's chest tightened. "What exactly are you trying to say, Victor?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You're the bet, Margot. Ethan wagered he could win you over. 6 months to charm you, and $1 million rides on the outcome. Fascinating, isn't it? How men like us find entertainment." Margot's world spun as Victor's words sunk in. She felt like she'd been punched, the air sucked out of the room. For weeks, she had started to believe in Ethan's sincerity, begun to think he might be different. And now, it all felt like a cruel joke. Margot left the event early, her mind a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, humiliation. They all collided as she marched down the busy Manhattan streets. When she arrived home, she paced her apartment, replaying every interaction with Ethan. Had he been laughing at her this whole time? Had every smile, every word, been part of his game? The next morning, Margot called Ethan, her voice calm but icy. "We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe at noon." Ethan sensed the tension in her voice but couldn't place its origin. When he arrived at the cafe, Margot was already seated, her posture stiff, her eyes unreadable. He approached cautiously, offering his usual smile. "Margot, save it." She cut him off, her tone sharp. "Victor told me everything." Ethan blinked, the words hitting him like a slap. "Victor?" "Yes, Victor," she snapped. "He told me about the bet, about how this was all just some twisted game for you. So, tell me, Ethan, was any of it real? Or was I just another prize to be won?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, the unshakable Ethan Crawford was at a loss. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Margot's gaze didn't waver, her anger palpable. "You know," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "I thought maybe, just maybe, you were different. But I was wrong. You're exactly like them." Ethan finally found his voice, though it was quieter than usual. "Margot, it's not what you think." "Then explain it to me," she challenged, leaning forward. "Explain how a bet on my life, on my trust, is anything but vile." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt washing over him. "It started as a bet, yes, but it's not that anymore. You have to believe me." Margot scoffed, shaking her head. "Believe you? After everything? Do you even hear yourself?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice urgent. "I didn't expect this, Margot. I didn't expect you to matter. But you do. I care about you." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite read. Then she stood, grabbing her bag. "I trusted you, Ethan, and you broke that. I don't care what you feel now. I don't need people like you in my life." And with that, she walked out, leaving Ethan sitting alone, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The days that followed were a blur for Ethan. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Margot's words echoed in his mind, cutting deeper than he thought possible. This wasn't just about the bet anymore. Somewhere along the way, she'd become more than a challenge, more than a game. Victor's smirk haunted him, a constant reminder of his mistake. Ethan confronted him at their usual club, his frustration boiling over. "Why did you tell her?" Victor shrugged, unbothered. "It was bound to come out eventually. Besides, you're the one who made the bet. Don't blame me because you lost control." Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't a game anymore." Victor laughed. "Of course it is, Ethan. It's always a game. You just don't like losing." Ethan left without another word, his mind racing. For the first time, he began to question everything, not just the bet, but himself. And as he stood alone in the quiet of his penthouse, he realized one thing. If he wanted to fix this, he'd have to become someone entirely different. Someone Margot could trust again. Ethan Crawford wasn't accustomed to feeling powerless. Yet here he was, sitting alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, unsure of how to move forward. Margot's words haunted him. "I trusted you and you broke that." She had walked away, and with her, she'd taken something he never thought he'd care about, her trust. He needed to find a way to fix this. But where did he even begin? In the days following their confrontation, Ethan did what he did best. He searched for answers. If he couldn't convince Margot with words, perhaps he could understand her better. He dove into her life, not out of manipulation, but out of a genuine desire to uncover what had shaped her. What he found, however, shook him to his core. Margot's life had been far from easy. Her father, Henry Bennett, had been a small business owner, running a modest manufacturing company that supported dozens of families in their community. But several years ago, his business had collapsed, crushed under the weight of a ruthless corporate acquisition. Ethan's corporate acquisition, the company Ethan had purchased at a bargain price, had been Margot's family's lifeline. Ethan stared at the old news articles on a screen, each one painting a picture of the destruction left in the wake of his ambition. Henry Bennett had fought to keep his business afloat, But the odds had been stacked against him. The loss had devastated the family. A few months later, Henry had taken his own life, leaving Margot and her mother to pick up the pieces. The weight of the realization was unbearable. Ethan had known that his cutthroat business practices left casualties, but they had always been faceless statistics. Now, those decisions had to face a name and a story, and that story was Margot's. Driven by guilt, Ethan sought out more details. He found out that shortly after her father's death, Margot had suffered another tragedy. She had been pregnant, a secret she had kept from everyone outside her immediate circle. The stress of losing her father and the financial collapse had taken its toll, and Margot had lost a baby. Ethan's stomach turned as he pieced it all together. Margot's guarded demeanor, her resistance to trust, her fierce independence. It all made sense now. She had built walls to protect herself from people like him, people who had taken everything from her without a second thought. The next time Ethan saw Margot, it wasn't by accident. She was volunteering at a community garden, her hands dirty with soil as she worked alongside a group of teenagers. Ethan watched her from a distance, unsure of how to approach. She looked so different here, in her element, calm, determined, and strong. When she finally noticed him, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Margot straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I thought we said everything we needed to say." "No," Ethan replied, taking a cautious step forward. "There's more. Things I didn't understand before. Things I need to apologize for." Margot folded her arms, her guard up as usual. "Go on then. Say your piece." Ethan hesitated, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I know what happened to your father. I know about the company, the acquisition, and my role in it." Her eyes narrowed, a flash of pain crossing her face. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath. "The company your father owned. It was one of my acquisitions. I didn't realize it at the time, but my actions destroyed everything he worked for. I'm so sorry, Margot. If I had known—" "Stop," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up here, dig into my past, and throw apologies at me like they'll fix anything." "I'm not trying to fix it," Ethan said, his tone earnest. I need you to know that I'm not that man anymore. I want to be better." Margot shook her head, stepping back as if his words physically pushed her away. "You can't undo what you've done, Ethan. My father is gone. My family was destroyed. And you just moved on like it didn't matter." For the first time, Ethan truly understood the depth of Margot's pain. It wasn't just about the bet. It wasn't even about him as a person. It was about everything he represented. The ruthless world that had taken so much from her. "I can't change the past," Ethan said quietly, "but I can try to make things right, even if it takes the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, Margot. I want you to know that I care." Margot's expression softened slightly, but the wall she had built remained firmly in place. "Caring doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't mean I can trust you." Ethan nodded, accepting her words. "I understand, but I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on this." As Margot turned back to her work, Ethan stayed for a moment, watching her. She didn't ask him to leave, but she didn't invite him to stay either. It was a small gesture, but one that gave him a sliver of hope. And as Ethan walked away, he realized that redemption wasn't something he could earn with a single act. It was a journey, one he was determined to take, no matter how long it took. Ethan Crawford wasn't one to wallow in guilt. He had built his empire on the principle of action, taking swift, decisive steps to achieve his goals. But now, the weight of what he'd done to Margot and her family was too much to ignore. For the first time, action wasn't about winning. It was about atonement, and he had no idea where to start. His first step came through a conversation with one of his senior advisors. Ethan spent hours poring over the financial and legal documents tied to the acquisition that had destroyed Margot's father's business. Every decision, every dollar saved at someone else's expense was laid bare. It was brutal to confront, but he couldn't turn away. By the end of the week, Ethan had a plan. He would establish a fund to support businesses like Henry Bennett's, companies crushed by corporate greed. But money alone wasn't enough. Ethan knew Margot would see through any hollow gesture. She would demand authenticity, and for that, he had to go further. He began visiting former employees of Henry's company, meeting them face to face to hear their stories. It was humbling, even humiliating at times, but he knew it was necessary. One Saturday morning, Ethan found himself in a modest suburban home, sitting across from Clara Higgins, a former secretary at Bennett Manufacturing. Her living room was simple but warm, filled with family photos and the faint smell of fresh coffee. Clara, now in her 60s, studied him carefully before speaking. "I didn't expect to see someone like you here," she said, her tone cautious but not hostile. Ethan nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't blame you for being surprised. I'm here because I need to take responsibility for what happened." Clara's expression softened slightly. "It wasn't just about the jobs, Mr. Crawford. That company was our community. When it fell apart, people didn't just lose their livelihoods. They lost their connection to each other. You can't buy that back with a check." Her words struck Ethan harder than he anticipated. He left her home feeling a new weight of responsibility, but also a clarity he hadn't felt before. If he wanted to make things right, he couldn't just repair what was broken. He had to rebuild something new. Meanwhile, Margot watched from the sidelines, hearing whispers of Ethan's efforts but refusing to let herself be swayed. She had seen men like him before, charmers with grand gestures and short-term fixes. But Ethan wasn't disappearing, and his actions weren't flashy. During a city council meeting for her nonprofit, Margot found herself face-to-face with Ethan once again. He had quietly offered to fund one of her projects, a community center renovation, without attaching his name or demanding recognition. When she saw his name on the paperwork, she felt a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Ethan," she said, cornering him after the meeting, "why are you doing this? What's your angle?" He looked at her, his expression unusually open. "No angle. I want to help." Margot crossed her arms. "And you expect me to believe this is purely out of the goodness of your heart?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," he replied. "I just want to show you that I'm trying to be better." His words lingered as Margot walked away. For weeks, she had hardened herself against the idea of forgiving him, convinced that his motives were selfish. But now, a small part of her wondered if he really was changing. Ethan's journey wasn't without setbacks. There were moments when his old habits threatened to resurface, moments when he felt the urge to take shortcuts or manipulate situations to his advantage. But every time, he thought of Margot. Her trust wasn't something he could win. It was something he had to earn day by day. One evening, as he stood in the newly renovated community center, watching families gather for the first time in years, Ethan felt a strange sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the kind of victory he was used to. It wasn't flashy or public, but it was real. Margot arrived late, her expression cautious as she took in the scene. Ethan noticed her immediately, his heart pounding as she approached. "You did this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I had help," he replied, trying to downplay his role. Margot studied him for a moment, then said, "You're different." Ethan's breath caught, but he didn't let himself get carried away. "I'm trying," he said simply. Margot nodded, her expression softening just enough to give him hope. "Keep trying," she said before walking away. And for the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't chasing redemption for her. It was for himself too. The soft glow of the evening sky framed the community center, where Ethan stood, observing the quiet hum of life inside. Families gathered, children laughed, and for a moment, it all felt surreal. It was a kind of scene he had never noticed before, one filled with genuine connection, untouched by power or profit. But Ethan wasn't here to bask in his work. Tonight, he had to face a truth he had been avoiding. Margot had arrived earlier, busy directing volunteers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. She moved with purpose, her usual grace mixed with a quiet intensity. Ethan watched her from a distance, rehearsing the words he needed to say. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, his confidence faltered. Taking a deep breath, he approached her. "Margot," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. She turned, her expression guarded. "Ethan, what is it? I need to talk to you." "Alone," he said, glancing at the bustling crowd around them. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "There's a bench outside. Let's talk there." The air was cooler outside, carrying the faint sounds of the city in the distance. They sat side by side on the bench, a careful distance between them. Margot crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on him. "Well, what's so important?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he started, "about what I've done, not just with the bet, but with your family." Margot's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Ethan drew a deep breath. "I didn't realize it at first, but I'm the reason your father's company went under. The acquisition that crushed Bennett Manufacturing. That was me, my company, my decisions." Her expression froze, a mixture of shock and disbelief flashing across her face. "You're lying," she said, her voice sharp. "I wish I were," he replied, his tone raw. "I didn't know it was your family at the time, but that doesn't excuse it. I took everything from you, Margot, and I'm sorry." Margot stood abruptly, her hands trembling. "Sorry?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You think an apology fixes this? My father worked himself into the ground trying to save that company. He believed in it. He believed in the people who worked for him. And you just destroyed it. For what? Profit." Ethan stood as well, his own emotions threatening to break through. "I didn't know," he said again. "I didn't know what it would cost. If I could go back." "But you can't," she snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "You can't go back, Ethan. You can't undo the damage you caused. My father is gone. And do you know what that did to us? To me?" For a moment, the world seemed to still. Margot turned away, wiping her eyes as she tried to compose herself. Ethan felt powerless, his usual strategies and charm utterly useless in the face of her pain. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter but no less firm. "After my father died, everything fell apart. My mother and I were drowning in debt. I tried to hold us together, but I lost something too. Someone." Ethan's chest tightened. "Your baby," he said softly, his voice heavy with sorrow. Margot froze, her shoulders stiffening. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "How do you know that?" "I looked into your past," he admitted. "Not to hurt you, but to understand. I had to know what I'd done, and what I've cost you." Her eyes burned with fury. "You had no right to dig into my life like that. You've taken enough from me, Ethan." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to face this, to face you, because for the first time in my life, I care about more than myself. And I care about you, Margot." Her anger faltered for a moment, replaced by something he couldn't quite identify. Pain? Sadness? Hope? Whatever it was. It passed quickly, replaced by the guarded expression he had come to know so well. Margot turned away again, her voice quiet but resolute. "You think caring about me changes anything? It doesn't. What's done is done. My father is gone. My baby is gone. And nothing you do will bring them back." "I know that," Ethan said, stepping closer but stopping himself from reaching out to her. "But I can try to make up for what I've done, not with words but with actions. I want to help rebuild what I destroyed, even if it takes the rest of my life." She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. "You think redemption is that simple? That you can just throw money or effort at the problem and fix everything?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "I don't think it's simple, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm not giving up. I'll keep trying, even if you never look at me the same way again." Margot turned back to him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she finally said, "Do what you want, Ethan, but don't do it for me. Do it because you can't live with yourself if you don't." She walked away, leaving him standing alone under the dim streetlights. The ache in his chest was sharper than ever, but her words echoed in his mind. For the first time, Ethan realized that his redemption wasn't about earning Margot's forgiveness. It was about becoming the man he had never been before. And that journey was only just beginning. Ethan Crawford had always believed in the power of control. Control over his life, his business, and the outcomes he sought. But standing in the ruins of his own choices, he realized that control wasn't the answer anymore. Change was. And change required surrendering the one thing he had clung to for years, his pride. After his conversation with Margot, Ethan threw himself into his efforts to make amends. He didn't just write checks or deliver apologies. He rolled up his sleeves and became involved in rebuilding the lives he had disrupted. He worked closely with local businesses, offering guidance and financial backing, not as a benefactor, but as an equal. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. But Margot remained distant. She heard of his efforts through others, saw glimpses of him at community events, but avoided direct contact. For her, trust was still a mountain Ethan hadn't climbed. And though she acknowledged his actions, she refused to let him into her life. One evening, Margot's resolve was tested. Ethan appeared at her office unannounced, his demeanor unusually subdued. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," he began, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "You're right about that," she replied, not looking up from her desk. "But I need your help," he continued, his voice steady. "I'm starting a program to support small businesses like your father's. I wanted to honor him and the community he built." Margot's pen stopped mid-motion. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Ethan said. "And because I need to let go of the person I was. The man who thought money and power were all that mattered. Your father believed in something better, and I want to carry that forward." Margot leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "You think one program will fix everything?" "No," he admitted, "but it's a start." She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll think about it." The weeks that followed brought a tentative truce between them. Margot agreed to consult on Ethan's initiative, though she kept their interactions strictly professional. Together, they worked on developing resources for struggling entrepreneurs, combining her insight with his expertise. During one of their late-night meetings, Margot finally broke the silence. "You're different," she said, her tone cautious. Ethan glanced up from his notes, surprised. "Different how?" "You listen now," she replied. "You used to talk like you already knew everything. Now, it feels like you're actually paying attention." Her words struck him more deeply than he expected. "I'm trying," he said simply. "For a long time, I thought success meant shutting everyone out. But you've shown me that it's about connection, and I don't want to lose that again." Margot looked away, her expression softening. "You still have a long way to go." "I know," he replied, his voice quiet, "but I'm willing to do the work." Margot's walls didn't come down overnight. She tested Ethan at every turn, challenging his decisions and questioning his motives. But with each challenge, he stood firm, refusing to fall back on the manipulative tactics that had once defined him. Then came the ultimate test. Margot sat across from him during one of their meetings, her gaze steady. "If you're serious about change," she began, "then you need to make a sacrifice." Ethan frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of sacrifice?" You need to let go of what made you the man you were, she said. Sell your company. Walk away from the empire that gave you all this power. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His company wasn't just a business. It was his identity, his legacy. But he saw the challenge in her eyes and knew she wasn't testing his financial resolve. She was testing his commitment to becoming someone better. The decision wasn't easy. Ethan spent days wrestling with the idea, weighing the cost of giving up the very thing that had defined him. But in the end, he realized that Margot was right. Redemption wasn't about what he could gain. It was about what he was willing to let go of. When Ethan informed his board of directors that he was stepping down and selling the company, the backlash was immediate. His peers called him reckless. His advisors questioned his sanity. But Ethan didn't flinch. For the first time, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known was possible. Margot's reaction to the news was muted. She listened quietly as Ethan told her about his decision, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "Because the man I want to be doesn't need that company," he replied. "And because I want to prove to you and to myself that I'm not the person I used to be." For a moment, Margot said nothing. Then, to Ethan's surprise, she smiled, a small, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Maybe you're not," she said softly. The warmth in her voice filled Ethan with a hope he hadn't dared to feel in months. For the first time, he felt like the distance between them was beginning to close. But as the weight of his past still lingered, Ethan knew that the hardest part of his journey was yet to come. The quiet of the evening felt heavier than usual as Ethan stood on Margot's doorstep, clutching a bouquet of peonies. It wasn't his usual grand gesture. There were no extravagant gifts or expensive dinners this time. The flowers were simple, chosen because he remembered her mentioning once, offhandedly, that they reminded her of better days. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door, bracing himself for whatever lay ahead. When Margot opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to guarded curiosity. "Ethan," she said, her tone measured. "I need to talk to you," he said, holding up the bouquet. "And these aren't a bribe, I promise." Margot hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Her small apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of freshly brewed tea. She motioned for him to sit, taking the flowers and placing them in a vase without a word. When she finally sat across from him, her gaze was steady but cautious. "Well," she prompted, crossing her arms. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "I've spent months trying to prove to you that I've changed," he began. "But I realize I haven't told you everything. And if I'm ever going to have a chance at earning your trust, I need to be honest about what's still weighing on me." Margot leaned back slightly, her arms still crossed. "Honesty would be a refreshing change," she said, her tone edged with sarcasm. Ethan didn't flinch. He had prepared himself for her skepticism. "I've been trying to atone for the damage I caused to your father's company, to your family," he said. "But there's one thing I can't fix, no matter how much I want to. And it's the thing that haunts me the most, what you lost because of me." Her expression hardened. "Ethan, don't." "I know about the baby," he interrupted softly, his voice breaking slightly. "I know the stress of what I did contributed to that loss, and I hate myself for it." Margot's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might say something, but she didn't. Her silence was deafening, but Ethan pressed on. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," he said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to know how deeply I regret everything. Not just the decisions I made, but the way I lived my life, the arrogance, the selfishness. If I could take it all back, I would, but all I can do now is try to be better." For a long moment, Margot said nothing. She stared at the table, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the wood. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "You think an apology erases the pain?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. "You think acknowledging what you did changes what I've been through?" "No," Ethan said immediately. "It doesn't. But I don't know what else to do except to tell you the truth and take responsibility for it." Margot stood and walked to the window, her back to him. Do you know what it's like, Ethan? To lose everything and have no one to turn to? My father was gone. My baby was gone. And I was left with nothing but memories of what could have been. Her words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper than the last. Ethan stood, unsure of whether to approach her or give her space. I can't imagine the pain you've been through, he said quietly. But I want to do whatever I can to help you move forward. Not because I expect anything in return, but because it's the only way I can live with myself. Margot turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. I've spent so much time hating you, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling. Hating what you represented. But somewhere along the way, I started seeing you differently, and that terrifies me. Ethan took a cautious step closer. Why does it terrify you? Because I don't know if I can trust you, she admitted. And I don't know if I can forgive you. But I also don't know if I can keep shutting you out. The air between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Ethan knew this was a pivotal moment, a fragile balance between hope and despair. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, he said, his voice steady. I know that takes time. But I'm here, Margot, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you need, however long it takes, I'll be here. Margot studied him, her expression softening just enough to give him hope. You've changed, Ethan. I can see that. But I need time to figure out if I can believe in you again. He nodded, his heart aching but grateful for even a sliver of possibility. Take all the time you need, he said. I'll be here. Margot walked back to the table, picking up her cup of tea. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't ask him to leave either. For the first time in months, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, one they might one day cross together. And as Ethan left that night, he realized that while forgiveness might still be far away, the door was no longer completely closed. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Margot's modest apartment, casting a warm glow on the wooden floors. Ethan stood in the kitchen, clumsily arranging a breakfast tray, coffee, toast, and a small vase with a single peony. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful. As he carried it to the living room, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. Margot was sitting on the couch, a book in her hands, her expression serene yet cautious. The tension between them had softened over the weeks, though the unspoken words still lingered. Ethan set the tray on the coffee table and sat across from her, careful not to intrude on her space. I didn't poison the coffee, I promise, he joked lightly, trying to ease the atmosphere. Margot looked up, a small smile breaking through her usual guarded demeanor. You're getting better at this normal human interaction thing, she replied, her tone teasing. Ethan chuckled, though he knew there was truth in her words. For so long, his life had been about power plays and calculated moves. But with Margot, everything was different. He wasn't trying to win her over anymore. He was simply trying to be there for her. As the days passed, the walls Margot had built began to come down. Slowly, cautiously, she started to let Ethan back into her life. They spent quiet evenings discussing books, community projects, and dreams they hadn't dared to voice before. For Ethan, these moments were transformative. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something real, something that couldn't be bought or manipulated. But the shadows of their past still lingered. One evening, as they walked through the city park, Margot stopped abruptly and turned to Ethan. There's something I need to say, she began, her voice steady, but tinged with vulnerability. Ethan nodded, his heart racing. I'm listening. Margot took a deep breath. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you for what happened to my family, to my father, to my baby. Those scars are deep, and they'll always be part of me. But I see the man you're trying to become, and that matters. Her words hit him with a wave of emotion. Margot, he began, his voice raw. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise you, every day, I'll work to be better. Not for me, for you, and for the people I've hurt. Margot reached for his hand, her grip firm yet gentle. Maybe forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, she said. Maybe it's about deciding what to carry forward. In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened in ways Ethan hadn't thought possible. They began working more closely on community projects, building something tangible from the ashes of their shared pain. Margot's nonprofit thrived with Ethan's quiet support, and she saw firsthand the sacrifices he continued to make. Not for her approval, but because he genuinely wanted to make a difference. Then, one crisp autumn evening, as they stood on the balcony of Margot's apartment, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Margot turned to him, her eyes widening in surprise. "Before you say anything," Ethan began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "this isn't a grand gesture or a game. This is me, standing here, asking you to take a chance on us. Not because we're perfect, but because I believe in what we can build together." Margot stared at him, her heart racing. She had spent so long guarding herself, holding on to her pain. But now, standing in front of the man who had caused her so much heartbreak, yet fought so hard to make amends, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, their wedding was a quiet affair, held in the same community center Ethan had helped restore. It wasn't lavish or extravagant, just close friends, a few family members, and a simple ceremony filled with love and sincerity. Margot wore a modest white dress, her smile radiant as she walked down the aisle. Ethan, for the first time in his life, felt truly at peace. As they exchanged vows, there were no grand promises or flowery words, just the truth. Margot vowed to let go of the pain that had bound her, and Ethan vowed to spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of her trust. Months later, as they settled into their new life together, Margot discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a mix of joy and trepidation, but this time, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Ethan's reaction was everything she hadn't expected. Tears of joy, laughter, and a determination to be the father he had never imagined himself becoming. One evening, as they sat together in their small garden, Margot rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" she murmured. Ethan smiled, his hand gently resting on hers. "Not me, but it's the best gamble I ever made." And as the stars glimmered above them, they knew that their story wasn't about erasing the past. It was about rewriting the future together. Enjoy the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.